So we can go on and start the second talk with Professor Kim.
So, thank you for this invitation, and I'm sorry to waste this time for these travels. So today I want to read about this my paper on Nishitani and the ridicule, and actually it is the second part of my paper that I had. I already read one paper from the same title last year. I think that was the first workshop on Nishitani. So the paper I want to read today, a part of the manuscript that I'm working for. So, but as you will find, there will be many problems and many. So I want your critical opinion that I can revise that. So I want your critical opinions and advice. So the title is Nishitani and the ridicule, and I want to talk about the channel forms as the water flows, and the personal structure of understanding sunyata, and what is the ridicule, and the ridicule as a style for expressing sunyata. So that is the contents that I will talk today. So when we say, well, if we say that Nishitani Keiji's first essay, Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckart, involves everything of his philosophy, it does not necessarily mean that we conventional myths that the first work contains everything is author seeks for his life long. With that statement, however, we insist first that Nishitani's reading of Nietzsche and Eckhart paved the way for his dealing with and overcoming his existential experience of nihility just in the place of that nihility. I think that is the starting point and the kernel of his philosophy of emptiness. Furthermore, with that statement, we also maintain that Nishitani's understanding of those two German thinkers gave him a decisive clue for expressing his insight in emptiness. Thus, when we are interested in how Nishitani brought his Buddhist philosophical ideas into the language, we pay attention anew to his essays quoting and treating the poetic world of Japanese haiku and poetry in East and West, including his last essay, Emptiness and Sameness. In these essays, Nishitani directly or indirectly mentioned how to express sunyata in the poetical language, which I will call the lyrical. Again, in terms of the everything myth I mentioned above, we can say, at the risk of oversimplification, that Nishitani's first article, Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart, anticipated and paved the way for all his endeavors for expressing his philosophy of emptiness. We want to argue that Nishitani regarded the lyrical language as the most proper style for expressing sunyata, because he found in Nietzsche and Eckhart the lyrical structure of understanding nihility seen from the Buddhist concept of sunyata. Far beyond merely a kind of literary genre, a narrowly defined term for literary critics, the lyrical means a paradigm for understanding the reality of oneself and the world, and also something more comprehensible beyond those two. It is not only a genre or style that inform the literary culture, but also a set of values or a structure of feeling that resisted a social episteme. Thus, understanding sunyata and expressing it cannot be separated. The reason must be rather simple. Understanding something accompanies the process of putting something into language, and the proper form of expressing something must be self-externalization of the content of that something. Here, I would like to cite Nishitani's following phrases, even though they appeared in a slightly different context from our current argument. I quote, "The channel forms as the water flows. That is, water does not flow into a ready-made waterway, but flows along freely its own way, and so makes its own waterway." The question is then, what form of expression is proper for his philosophy? To answer this question, I laid the idea of the thesis that for Nishitani, the proper form for expressing shunyata is lyrical because understanding shunyata has a lyrical structure. In this presentation, I will try to understand the relationship between shunyata, the quintessence of Nishitani's thought, and his endeavors to express that shunyata through language. What did Nishitani learn from Nietzsche and Eckhart about the fundamental structure of understanding shunyata or nihility? To answer this question, I will refer to his first essay focusing on Nishitani's quotation from Nietzsche and Eckhart, which showed the quintessential way of wrestling with the problem Nishitani regarded as crucial. I mean the problem of nihility and overcoming of the nihility. The first has to do with his reading of Nietzsche's with a quotation. I quote, God is that can be understood in this sense. It opens an abyss within life, before which we can no longer say that we live in the presence of God or the love of God, that we are dead to ourselves and living in God, that we live in union with God, and so forth. Nietzsche once remarked, if we look into the abyss long enough, the abyss will look back at you. As he admitted, Nishitani's reading of the passage from Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil does not coincide with Nietzsche's original text, which the fuller context makes clear. Nietzsche said in his book, whoever fights with the monsters should see it that he does not become one himself. Furthermore, when you stare for a long time into an abyss, the abyss stares back into you. However, whatever that may be, we are more interested in why Nishitani used the phrase as he did. For now, it is enough to recall the close but complex relations between Nietzsche's philosophy and lyric poetry, and the fact that Nietzsche's style did not aim to describe, but to imbue his subject matter with a passion that fed lyrical expression into his prose. Next, we may single out Nishitani's citation from Eckhart. We begin Eckhart's sermon on John as chapter 16, verse 7, on obstacles of true spirituality, in which Eckhart writes, where can we see God except with a blind eye, know God except with ignorance, understand God except with unreason? Nishitani offers his interpretation with additional quotations. I quote, God destroys the form of the self, and the self destroys the image of God. Eckart even says, I should become God, and God should become me. If we do not read these phrases without the dialect of reciprocal negation, they will seem so much nonsense. The insight includes the seer and the seen, two eyes facing each other. Two gazes crossing each other should be one eye, one gaze. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. No doubt, Nishitani felt the phrase he quoted represented the quintessence of Eckhart's thought. God is nothingness that hides itself from our conventional way of seeing God as an object. On the contrary, this divine nothingness is an abyss that blinds our ability to see. Nevertheless, this deprivation arises from a divine love that makes us see God as God sees himself. In the sense, it is in a sense no different from Nietzsche's abyss, which deprives us of our heteronomous ground of being and brings us to rebirth as an independent subjectivity. In our concern, the poetic style of what I mean to be philosophical and theological statement is of greater interest than the passage's content itself. The abyss stares at me, and I stare at the abyss. My eyes that see God are the eyes of God that see me. This reciprocal simultaneity of staring and seeing are personalized expressions in which Nishitani understands the structure of the birth of a true self, the self of an elementary subjectivity. As we will see later, these personalized expressions of Nietzsche and Eckhart, or Nishitani's interpretation of Nietzsche and Eckhart, are typical of the lyrical writing style. This personalized understanding structure can be found in Nishitani's other essay. In his article on the self-Tao relationship in Zen Buddhism, Nishitani introduced a koan in the form of a dialogue between two Zen masters known as the 68th rule of the Heidegger law. Entering into a relationship that addresses something that deprives one of the basis of one's existence, as if it were the other party to the discussion, provides a new perspective on the I-Tao relationship. 교장 Eckart asked Sancho again, "What is your name?" Sancho said, "Eckart." Eckart replied, "교장, that's my name." "Well then," said Sancho, "my name is Enen." 교장 roared with laughter. According to Nishitani, it is in this koan that the most profound ground appears, infinitely terrible and yet infinitely beautiful, which is hidden in the everyday encounter of the I and Tao relationship. When someone calls himself by my name, my being is deprived and falls into nothingness. But at the same time, the encounter with the Tao teaches me that I am dependent on and open to the other, whose ultimate form is nothingness, death, which is the absolute other to me. In other words, I am the being pierced by nothingness, the boundless abyss. I and Tao teach us that center of the I is not within myself, but that I am the other century. Furthermore, Nishitani read Nietzsche and Eckhart from the hermeneutical situation in which they found themselves. Both thinkers were, so Nishitani said, both thinkers were living in the age of crisis where the synthesis of thinking and living had collapsed, which was symbolized by the death of Thomas and Heidegger. As Karl Lewitz says, the crisis of Hegelian philosophy in the 19th century was simultaneously a crisis of Christianity. You could say the same stroke that the crisis of Thomism in the 13th century was a crisis of Christianity in its synthesis of reason and faith. For them, there must be a way of lighting it to take the crisis in mind outside, give it a visible form, and overcome it. The lyrical language is a poetical style for facing and overcoming that kind of crisis. As Stéphane Mallarmé, the French poet of symbolism, said, poetry is a language of a state of crisis. The following verses by Chu Yan, a great Chinese poet in the Warring State period, in which we find the first uses of the term the lyric, the shooting in Chinese literature, illustrate the poet's function, the lyrical poet function as responding to that crisis. In his poetry collection, Song of the South, the Chu Yan sang, "Cherishing my plaint, I give sorrows free rein. Venting rancor, I tell of pent-up feelings." So the lyric is not only the spontaneous overflow of powerful passion, just by said by William Wordsworth, it is also a way of providing the feeling of sorrow and rancor with a free vein through which those crisis feelings and a way for expressing the structure of those feelings. What is the lyrical? Then how can we define the lyrical? According to Jonathan Fuller, the fundamental laws of the trope in the lyrics are those of apostrophe, that is the addresses to something that is not the empirical listener, and prosopopopeia, that giving of face and voice to, and thus the animation of what would not otherwise be a living interlocutor. The tropes in the lyric poem are addressed to something impersonal, but make it seem as if it had a personality with which to establish an out-out relationship. Fuller gives an example from the lyrics of Baudelaire, or Lost Thou Art Sick, and Shelley, or Wild West Wine. His allusion to Baudelaire figures of speech, the contemplation, the be wise of my grave, shows a different affinity with our approach to nihility. The poet calls out to or evokes his grief or woe as if it was something he could talk about. We may say that calling out to the grief is the point way of trying to understand that. Before that evocation, his grief was formless, abstract, and anonymous. In the most radical sense, it did not even exist. However, now the grief steps out and stands before the poet who can look at it in the face. As Chul says, both apostrophe and prosopopeia works to create out-out relations and structure of specularity, which seem characteristic of the dramatic prospect by lyric. But the lyrical is not necessarily restricted to the form of poetry. You can find the lyrical in the narrative and hopefully, I hope, maybe in the academic writings too. For example, let's see Yasunari Kawabata's short novel, Lyric Poem, Jojoka. The title of this novel itself is the Lyric Poem, which begins with the phrase, speaking to the dead was a sad human custom. This story is made up by a narration of a young woman named Tatsue, addressing a past lover who is dead. Actually, he betrayed her and married another woman. To call her dead lover, who is now absent, is to face the reality of the death of herself and death of all living things. Moreover, as Chul emphasizes, the lyric poetry and lyric function as narrative do not demand explanation. I'm sorry, lyric poetry and lyric fiction. Lyric poetry do not demand explanation or interpretation from the reader, but it has a performative character that attracts the reader's attention to what happens here and now. In a narrative story, causal development, inference, and judgment are essential. In this respect, the story's main point is found in the past and subject to interpretation, and for that same reason, the future is also grasped in the story as an extension of the past, which could be found in the structure of the detective story. In contrast, what is essential in lyric poetry and lyrical fiction is to focus the reader on what happens in the present. In the same sense, the lyric poet is not the story's protagonist, and the story's plot is not of his concern. By personification of his feelings, the poet also summons the past or the future to the present, through which he overcomes the gap between the subject and object. The aim of the lyric is not to be interpreted intellectually by the reader's analysis, but to have the reader be absorbed into and identify with what is written in the poem, which is like a religious ritual. In other words, the narrative aims to find the concealed fact of those events, bringing the reader a reasonable solution. Instead, the lyric leads the reader to be absorbed into the world a poem opens. It is ritualistic, like the Eucharistic, in that it asks the reader to participate in the ritual here and now. Now we want to go back to the first part of my thesis I raised at the beginning of this article. That means Nishitani regarded the lyrical language as the most proper style for expressing shunyata. Jan van Bracht, the translator of Nishitani's main work, Shukyo to Ananika, highlighted that Nishitani's Buddhist philosophy of emptiness expressed in almost lyrical terms. According to this eminent translator who understood Nishitani thoroughly, Nishitani emphasized in his book the positive relevance of his understanding of shunyata to people's ordinary cultural and social lives. Nishitani described how emptiness positively constructs the foundation of people's ordinary lives, contrasting our presupposition that it is something abstract, outwardly transcendent. Emptiness seeps out from every corner of reality as things, in things, and through things. I quote Van Bracht. The field of emptiness, which, while resulting from an absolute negation, forms the basis of an absolutely positive cultural attitude. Indeed, the absoluteness of each immediately present individual thing, cut off from all conditions and relativizing elements, and the freedom and creativity of the self totally open to an infinite universality on the field of emptiness are exalted here in almost lyrical terms. Van Brock's description gives us the impression that Nishitani colors our ordinary daily life with emptiness and depicts everyday life as being pumped up from the abyss of emptiness. And that brings us the reality experience and also the birth of a new authentic self. His fundamental attitude of dealing with emptiness consists of breaking it through. To break through that emptiness, we must go boldly deep down where the nihility exists and face it ahead, by which a new world will be opened. To do that, Nishitani used in his book many phrases from the literature, including haiku, the Buddhist poetry of enlightenment, gatha, and lyric poems in East and West, with which he understood and explained the purpose of sunyata. Van Brock's following comment on the general feature of Japanese or Asian philosophical discourse could be applied to the characteristics of Nishitani's writing style at most. I quote, "We might first keep in mind the general Eastern antipathy to overly direct and assertive language in everyday intercourse. In place of an absolute trumpeting of opinion in terms that the listener should not be able to disregard. Japanese prefers to circumnavigate an issue, tossing out subtle hints that permit only a careful listener to surmise where the unspoken core of the question lies. The same indirectness or circularity applies to philosophical argumentation. While the Western idea of analysis prizes clarity and distinctness and progress in a straight line from one logical step to the next, Japanese philosophical style proceeds by way of concentric circles." So Nishitani invites us to circumnavigate the reality he showed before us, the way of which he forms the concentric circles. To read Nishitani means to walk with him as a tour guide and see the scenery unfolding before our eyes. I quote one more from Van Brock. "Nishitani certainly shows that spiral repetitiveness to the highest degree. His paragraphs not uncommonly run to several pages, each and do not really yield to being broken up. But whether this strikes one as magical incantation or simply gets on one's nerves, the loss is ours if we allow the foreigners of style to close us off altogether from the insight it orchestrates for us." As circumnavigate and spiral effectiveness imply, that both terms imply, Nishitani wrote as if someone described the scenery before his eyes while walking the way, or as if a falcon gradually approached its object while making a spiral concentric movement. We may expand Van Brock's idea mentioned above to the thought that Nishitani's writing style in general is an expressionist attempt to fill ordinary language with the symbolic power to depict the lyrical structure of the world. His writing intends to show us the reality of sunyata in ordinary life, not by describing it with informative language, but by portraying it with poetical language. As a condensed form of the language or as something purely spoken, if we say Heidegger, ein rein gesprochenes, the poem does not deliver any objective information. It works to reveal the reality that is being penetrated by the double exposure, the term of photography that concerns visuality, the double exposure of being and non-being. It is in this context that Nishitani cites some tropes in the Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. A New York City under the brown fog of winter dawn, a cloud float over London Bridge, so many, I had not thought death has undone so many. If so, what does it mean that it offers sunyata as the lyric style to express itself? Nishitani's interest in poetry left traces in his various essays steadily. His study on Hansan, a legendary Chinese poet who is supposed to have lived in the 19th century, or on Matsuo Basho, shows us that he felt a great affinity to the world of poetry for understanding and expressing the Buddhist insight. We want to read carefully his essays on mysticism to understand Nishitani's view of poetry. In this essay, he points out first the word mystic has its origin in the Greek word muein, meaning to close eyes and to close mouth. Relying on its original meaning, Nishitani defined mysticism as a way to hear God's voice in the silence and be in the light of God directly in one's own soul. That is, to be seen by God through the light from God. Then, as an example of touching things far beyond intellect and emotion, Nishitani mentioned the well-known haiku of Basho. When I look closer, I see Dajana blooming underneath the hedge. What does then mysticism have to do with the poem that asks us to recite it by opening our mouths and lead us to see the world by opening our eyes? Did not Nishitani himself said that mysticism asks us to close our eyes and shut our mouths? Where is the affinity between mysticism and poetical expression? According to Nishitani, the poem depicts the poet's feelings and opens our eyes to the life of nature. Nevertheless, the life of nature is not an object that can be analyzed or interpreted by the individual awareness or individual feelings, but it must be observed and intuited into the life of nature, as it is said, the intuition of the universe. We have to say instead that the mind eye is opening the floor. The floor is the floor, and the man is man. And quoting Nishitani, the man is man. Nevertheless, at the same time, a deep relation is established there so that a realm is open in which those two becomes one. It is the true feeling of the poet. There, the poet is touched by the flower's life as it is alive. This unity of life cannot be uttered by the language, as the unity with God is unspeakable. It explains the affinity between mysticism and poetry. However, things are not that simple. Unity with God in mysticism is far different from unity with the life of nature in poetry, because God is absolute others to ourselves and the whole world. So the separation between God and us is absolute. Then the only way to be united with God, who is totally different from man, is then to annihilate ourselves or to be dead to ourselves, by which we can crack down the shell of the self and go outside beyond ourselves. In such a state of ecstasy, where we reach the bottom of the self, we find the self is no longer the self. The form of the self is lost, just as the form of God is vanished. We call it unio mystica. We can have an authentically personal relationship with God in unio mystica, where our soul becomes a divine being by losing its form. The same can be said of the haiku, the lyrical poem by Basho, in which he sang the unity of life with nature. But at the time, the feeling, he said, the feeling the lyrics expose are feelings in the realm of the non-difference, and it is asked for us to live our own thought. In Emptiness and Sameness, his last and unfinished essay, Nishitani's affinity to the lyrical poems appeared most impressively. In this unfinished article, he analyzed some Japanese haiku and Chinese Buddhist poems, including Passing by the Xiangji Temple or Climbing the Bianzhu Temple by Wang Wei. Wang Wei is the famous Chinese scholar and his poet, and he's standing shoulder to shoulder with some other famous poet. And he is one of the essential figures in shaping the Chinese lyrical tradition with the Buddhist influence. He was called by his own other name, Shufo, that means the Buddha of the poetry. So, by using this the poem, Nishitani want to visualize the Buddhist notion of emptiness. The image he suggests communicates the Buddhist-like feeling about the teachings. For Nishitani, poetry has a more direct affinity to religion than to philosophy because poetry pursues the ground of knowledge in much the same way religion does. In contrast to philosophical inquiry, which analyzed experience by objectifying cognition, poetry penetrates the source of experience without departing from the experience. In this sense, he says poetry shares the same standpoint with religion. While digging into the ground of knowledge, religion also includes a tendency to overcome the standpoint of knowledge. Poetry and arts in general acknowledge sense, perception, emotion, and sentiment as critical elements in experience. The arts rotate around them, attempt to penetrate the emotions in their innermost parts. To illustrate his point, Nishitani again cites a haiku of the famous 17th century Japanese haiku poet Naito Joso, one of the disciples of Basho. The bottom of loneliness falls off, or the falling slit. In this sense, I have to skip other passages. In this sense, poetry language is not an instrument of cognitive reflection, but leads us to the place where reality comes into being as something given in the first place, a place where reality is original, taking precedence over the reflection, an actual place where reality is experienced as a thing in itself. I think Nishitani found the most proper way of expressing the place as the bottomless bottom in the lyrical language because he discovered that how Nietzsche and Eckhart reached the bottom of the self is no different from how the lyric poem depicts it. Nietzsche staring at the abyss in the face, and Eckhart's flash of insight that my eye and the eye of God are the same, express the place as the bottomless bottom, where there's no separation of nihility and human being, humanity and divinity, or sunyata and a human being. It is where the inner feelings of the poet and the phenomena of the surrounding world have not yet been distinguished as two realities. The affinities that Nietzsche, Eckhart, and Nishitani shared for poetical expression directly result from their sharing of that experience, I think. So some remarks for further research for my personal research. In this essay, I have argued that the lyrical writing style prevailed in the writing style of the Keiji Nishitani, who tried to build up a Buddhist philosophy accepting Nietzsche's nihilism and Eckhart's Christian mysticism. That means, I said, as I said, repeatedly, the lyric writing style emerges from the contents of Nishitani's thought itself. How can we then understand and locate this lyrical style in Asian intellectual history? This question is for me very crucial because Asian theology, brought up by the encounter with Buddhism, should find its appropriate writing style from none other than Asian intellectual history. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. Okay, let's start with questions or comments. I think we can go till, well, for like 20 minutes.
I'd like to thank Professor Kim for this wonderful new charter for Asian theological language. You began with a quotation from Mallarmé, which I'd never heard before, which is wonderful, that you said poetry is the language of a state of crisis, la poésie est la langue d'un état de crise. I can't find the actual quotation, but I found the more famous one, which I think would apply to Basho as well as to Western poetry. He says, the pure work implies the elocutory disappearance of the poet. L'œuvre pure implique la disparition élocutoire du poète, who cedes the initiative to words by the clash of their mobilized inequality, qui cède l'initiative aux mots par le heurt de leur inégalité mobilisée. Mobilized, the words are mobilized by the clash of their inequality, and they brighten each other by reciprocal reflections. Ils s'allument de reflets réciproques. So this is what Basho does. He has the words allowed to clash and allowed to illuminate each other, and the poet as a subjective lyrical master of the show disappears. It's not, of course, that the Mallarmian writers do bring back the self, Rilke, for example, or Yeats, but they bring him back on new premises. It's no longer the ordinary self, as T.S. Eliot would put it, the bundle of accidents that gets up every morning and that does various things. It's kind of a new poetic creation, born out of the language itself. And Basho could find a new interpretation if he was connected with this Mallarmian tradition of, a new kind of non-self lyricism.
Thank you, Professor Oli. Actually, that's the part I want to hear you learn from you, the French and the English literature. So I just quoted some phrases from the English and the French poet, but I have no idea of what this the French literature or the Western lyric itself means. But I just have interest in them because I want to approach them from. Last year I was I can have one year sabbatical leave, and I try to learn something from this Chinese lyrical tradition. So my interest, my concern is that how I can write these Asian theological insight through or in the writing style of Asian literature. So because I think this, as the Nishitani, this is my personal opinion. I think Nishitani learned from Nietzsche or Eckhart how to bring that insight into language. So for me, it is important that I think for Nishitani, what Nietzsche itself is or what Eckhart itself is not so important for him. I think he tried to pick up something from Nietzsche and Eckhart, and with those things, he tried to furnish his own garden, so I think. And the main point he learned from Nietzsche and Eckhart is, in my opinion, is the way of expression. So he found in Nietzsche and Eckhart this postural structure of reality. How Nietzsche can deal with the abyss, and how did Eckhart bring his insight into world. Very interesting. Those two thinkers used some personalized language, face to face, eye to eye. So I think, it's my opinion, Nishitani had learned that, and then his ideas remained all the way in his thinking and life. So that is expressed also in many articles on the poetry or on haiku, and also in his last articles, the Koto Soku. So that's my, I do not know whether I can call it the thesis or not, but this is my personal opinion. And then I can use that Nishitani's way of thinking and way of expressing into concern. That is the how to write the Asian theology. So I want to go back to Dr. Oliver's comment. So please, I just really want to learn the word of the point is Mallarmé or this Baudelaire or something. Thank you so much.
I got this book from the author. It's a very, very difficult book. At least I find it difficult. The Operativity of Language in Meister Eckart. The operativity, that's a horrible word, but how language functions in Eckart. And it's a bit like what you're saying. It's
also again, please, the
operativité du langage chez Maître Eckart. And he has a Latin subtitle, Obstetricandi Scientia, whatever that means. Yves Meessen, Meessen. Published by Peters Louvain in 2021. To speak otherwise of God, looks at his Latin and then at his German language, and he ends up, general conclusion, for another scientificity of theology, for a different scientificity of theology. It's
very difficult.
As if to say that it's theology that tries to be scientific is bad theology. It has to develop its own scientificity, just as a poet has to develop its own lyrical style. I mean, poets think, and theologians also think, but they don't necessarily think in a scientific way in the normal sense.
I think that, yes. Thank you so much.
Jim, please.
Just a really simple comment. You talked about Nishitani picked up his lyrical style from Eckhart and from Nietzsche. This is actually something very extraordinary, I think, because Nishitani's German was not that good. He spoke haltingly. He had a small vocabulary. Took him a long time to communicate. I know because Graham Parks and I spent many hours talking to Nishitani. That was the only time I ever heard him actually speaking German. But if you consider that, he probably read the text slowly, and he didn't pick up the sound, the movement, the beauty, the lyrics, which is also lost on me most of the time in German. I know that. So you have to ask, what was it that attracted him to the German of Nietzsche and Eckhart? In German, Nietzsche has a punch, and his words are well chosen, and they flow and so forth. That's not what he picked up. I think what he picked up was the idea of taking an image, in the case of Nietzsche, or in the case of Eckhart, taking a passage from scripture and reimagining it completely, doing with it whatever you wanted to do, not caring what the scholar said, not quoting the exegetes, but playing freely with it. Well, Eckhart also does it with images, right? He had a big battle with Dominicans over the use of images. I think that's the clue to Nishitani's lyricism, is his playing with images and turning a simple quote, a poem, or a quote from a Buddhist text into an image, and then walking around it, as Van Braque says very elegantly.
Circumnavigate, yeah. It's a beautiful word, circumnavigate. And I also said, in the first presentation, Professor Love said he starts selective readings, if I remember correctly. So that is one of the characteristics of Nishitani's when he tried to understand Nietzsche and Eckhart. So yes, and then that's, if I can, I want to learn from him, and then using his ideas, and how can I, for example, write or express this Asian theological insight?
I think that's the thing that more scholars of Nishitani have to learn. Nishitani used Eckhart and he used Nietzsche, and you wouldn't quote him to say what Nietzsche said or what what Eckart said. He's not a reliable source.
Mm.
But when we read Nishitani, we read him like a source material. We describe his thoughts, we organize it, we battle with other scholars about what he said and what he didn't say, instead of imitating him.
Yes.
Nishitani would be much happier if people simply imitated his way of thinking instead of trying to be faithful to his every choice of word.
Yes. Yes. So I think Nishitani liberated me from quoting exactly or finding sources who said that or who did not say that. So that he helped me to abandon the books. I don't know whether I can say that, but anyway, he teach me a way of thinking, I think, not many information. So that is important. I try to find from him, in him. Thank you.
I'd say something else about, make a note about Nishitani's style, is that if you read the Japanese, not this essay is a very early one, but even of his late essays, and you read the Japanese of Shukyoto and Anika, the styles are remarkably different, the Japanese style.
Mm.
And that's because the Shukyoto and Anika was gone over line by Minamoto Ryoen.
Mm.
He rewrote it because these were talks that Nishitani gave and they were transcribed.
Mm.
So I can't publish this. And he went over it very carefully. And I think it also affected the way Nishitani wrote later when he saw what Minamoto did to his text.
Okay. So, for example, when I make a sermon, I wrote down and I read it. But when I wrote article, I did not read it. So that's big difference. So I just put 15 pages articles, then I do not read it in with my own voice. But I wrote down the sermon, I read it. So it's big differences. By listening my own voice, I can find something complicated, something weird. Then I try to revise. But when I write the articles, I even do not to see that. So that's a big difference, I think. So how can we, theologian, for example, I do not know what the philosopher try to do, but as theologian, I think we have to change that style of writing the articles to so-called the academic articles. So anyway, that's the aim of that. I wrote this article, so I don't know whether it works or not.
So we can finish here Professor Kim talk. Thank you very much, Professor Kim.